So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the afternoon, Professor Bron Taylor. He is the Samuel S. Hill Professor of Ethics at the University of Florida, where is the founder of the Society of Religion, Nature, and Culture and the director of the graduate program in Religion and Nature. He's published widely on environmental resistance movements and is the editor-in-chief of the Continuum Encyclopedia of Religion and Nature. So, Bron, it's a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Don. It's really a privilege to be here, not only to be at such a wonderful institution, but also to be here among people whose work I have read and I've looked up to for so very long. So it's a great privilege to be here. In this presentation, I'm going to explore the emergence and increasing global diffusion and possibly decisive impact on the future of religion and ethics of what I call dark green religion. By dark green religion, I mean religion that considers nature to be sacred, imbued with intrinsic value, and worthy of reverent care. By the phrase, from the ground up, I signal a focus on the roots of such spirituality. By roots, I mean both the intellectual roots, namely the influential ideas of the environmental intelligentsia promoting such spirituality, as well as, and here I echo Donald Worster a little bit from this morning, as well as the contributions of grassroots social actors and movements. I will examine both sorts of roots by looking at a number of examples of dark green religion within what I will call the environmentalist milieu. Given my own field work, and because in our conclave today we have some of the leading scholars who have illuminated the impact of green intellectuals on green spirituality and politics, I will focus on less well-known examples within the grassroots environmental movements, in popular culture, and perhaps unexpectedly in prominent international venues. I hope that the reciprocal influences and synergies between green intellectual production and grassroots political and ritual performances will become increasingly clear along the way. Most of us know in recent decades that debates have raged over the relationships between religions, cultures, and the Earth's living systems. Some assert that religious perceptions and beliefs have always been closely associated with natural phenomena, and that much religion originated in the worship of nature. Others purport to find links between religious types and the specific natural habitats that they claim to give rise to them. Still others have taken a decidedly reductionistic approach, asserting that religion is a byproduct of evolutionary processes. According to such theory, evolution neither accounts for the origins of religion nor has much to do with human environmental impacts, positively or negatively. And it certainly did not appear because natural selection favors it as a cultural adaptation that favors ecological health and thus human procreative success. Still others have concluded, quite to the contrary, that religious beliefs and practices, including some forms of ritualizing, sometimes or always, depending on the theorist, evolved in ways that function in ecologically adaptive manners. Such functional adaptationists provide a theoretical basis for the idea that religion can, or does, contribute to environmentally sustainable communities. Probably better known are those who have blamed specific religions, or religion in general, for promoting worldviews that lead to environmental destruction. Such criticisms and the widely varied responses they generated led to a scholarly field most commonly called religion and ecology, and most prevalently characterized by efforts to recover or invent from the resources in existing traditions ideas that can be used to promote environmentally responsible attitudes and behaviors. This work been undertaken both by religious thinkers, leaders, and practitioners, as well as by some scholars who focus on specific traditions and are interested in helping them to become more environmentally friendly. The most impressive example of this kind of scholarly enterprise was the series of conferences and the subsequent book series that unfolded between 1996 and 2004, right here, that we've already heard mentioned by Mary Evelyn Tucker and that she and others here were involved in. And these were conducted, of course, with support from a diversity of environmental, religious, and animal welfare groups, as many of you know. Put simply, The ferment has been about whether and where and under what circumstances religion has or might be green. In other words, does it or can it assume forms that promote environmental responsibility? While such a hope is difficult to maintain when looking critically at the available evidence, there are forms of green emerging that are emerging, and moreover, these forms are going global in dramatic, if yet nascent ways. It is this evidence that I will spotlight, and have been in recent writings. Today I will key in on a subset of green religion that I call dark green religion. Although both green religion and dark green religion have deep historical antecedents, their growing strength and contemporary novelties make it possible to consider them both new religious movements, as well as to suggest that they might well be contributing to an emerging global civic earth religion. Green religion, as I'm using the term, is a broad umbrella for every type of religious environmentalism, both those with deep roots in Western and Asian cultures and more recent innovations that have been and are emerging from the age of ecology. Here is my outline. I'm on point 1. The types of religious environmentalism where religious practitioners and scholars affiliated with the world's most prevalent religious traditions seek to reveal and promote their putatively environmentally friendly dimensions, or to develop such dimensions where they are believed to be missing or anemic, is not my primary focus today, for this is relatively well-known terrain. It does, however, provide an important backdrop, and it will be apparent in much of what follows that such developments are contributing importantly to the prospective green future for religion and ethics, to which I'll get eventually. Number 2. Religions that consider nature to be sacred in some way are nothing new in Western culture, but they are being revitalized and spreading. We've seen some examples of that today. Clarence Blacken's Traces on the Rhodian Shore, Donald Worster's Nature's Economy, and Lawrence Buell's The Environmental Imagination all analyze important aspects of such nature as sacred religions. In their own ways, they illustrate that such religions have deep roots in long-standing organic and esoteric traditions in the Western world. They have also noted, however, that as scientific and ecological paradigms have shifted, so have the forms of such spirituality. These and other scholars have well analyzed the early and dramatic revival of such nature religions, often tracing this to 18th century European Romanticism, which dramatically influenced nature-related religious production in North America, which in turn reinforced and strengthened such movements in Europe. Worster and Buell have been among those scholars who have exposed the roots of what we call the biocentric turn in ecological science and literature, namely the turn toward axiology, or value theory, in which the intrinsic value of nature is expressed. Today, I'm going to be focusing, as I mentioned, on dark green religion, the third point there, which is deep ecological or biocentric, and reflects an axiology wherein non-human species have intrinsic value. Such religion expresses and promotes an ethics of kinship between human beings and other life forms. As Lawrence Buell has especially well documented, Henry David Thoreau is something of a patron saint for such spirituality in America, casting a very long shadow, influencing virtually all of the 20th century's most important environmentalist thinkers, including John Muir, John Burroughs, Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, Wendell Berry, Edward Abbey, Gary Snyder, James Lovelock, and many more. Indeed, both Thoreau and these progeny have all assumed iconic status within the pantheon of saints, favorite among participants in contemporary nature, religion, and environmentalist circles. 4 types of dark green religion. There are too many good examples to fully survey today, so I will begin by analyzing 4 types of dark green spirituality emerging forcefully since Earth Day, providing a few examples from each type. Now, of course, as Michael so well illustrated, all of these sorts of terms can be problematic and could be interrogated at some length. Nevertheless, when I look at problematic terms such as animism, and folks who have studied the origins of the term know that in its very genesis it's problematic in a number of ways and on a number of levels. Part of what's interesting to me about that term is the way in which, not only among scholars, but among ordinary folks, how it has a certain currency. And it even becomes a self-description for many people. So it has a meaning in popular parlance, as I think the rest of these terms do. And so I'm interested in part in the ways in which people use these sorts of terms, kind of on the ground. Now, the first two types that you see on the screen are forms of animism. One I'm calling supernaturalistic and the other naturalistic. The second type I label Gaian earth religion as shorthand for holistic and organicist worldviews. Again, one form is supernaturalistic, which I will call Gaian spirituality. The other, naturalistic, which I will call Gaian naturalism. This chart depicts this typology. Note that it has blurred lines between the types, suggesting that it represents tendencies and trends rather than uncomplicated, static, and rigid clusters of individuals and movements. If I were a little more sophisticated with my PowerPoint, I would probably have bigger gaps in the lines here, here, and here, and very few gaps in the lines here in what I'm calling Gaian naturalism. They don't play ball quite as much as the other ones, the ones who I would put firmly in that lower right-hand category, and that'll become a little bit clearer in a minute. So, animism, let's see. That thing did go away when we did the video projector controls. Here we go. Yeah. Okay, we can put that back on. Animism is most fundamentally about the perception of spiritual intelligences, or life forces, animating natural entities and living things. Animistic perception is often accompanied by ethical beliefs about the sorts of relationships people have or should have with such beings or forces, or conversely, with sorts of behaviors one should avoid with regard to them. Sometimes animism involves communication or even communion with such spiritual intelligences or life forces. Such a worldview need not, but may, involve the perception that the spiritual intelligences or life forces are divine and should be worshipped and or beseeched for favors. But such a worldview usually does enjoin respect, if not reverence for, and veneration of such intelligences and forces. I'm trying to parse my words here carefully when I speak of spiritual intelligences or life forces. With the term spiritual intelligences, I seek to capture the beliefs of those for whom there is some immaterial, supernaturalistic dimension to the animist perception. With life forces, I refer to those who are agnostic or skeptical of any immaterial dimension underlying the life forces they perceive and with whom they seek understanding and connection. In both cases, animism, as I am reconfiguring the notion, involves a shared perception that beings or entities in nature have their own integrity, their own ways of being, and even their own intelligences. With such animism, we can, at least by conjecture and imagination, sometimes through ritual action and other practices, come to understand something of these other life forces. Gaian earth religion, again, as I am reconfiguring the construction, stands firmly in the organicist tradition and takes the biosphere, or the universe, as a whole, and the complex internal relations of its constitutive parts and energetic systems as the fundamental thing to understand and venerate. Moreover, such perspective takes the whole, usually as understood scientifically, but not always exclusively so, as something of a model, and thus, defying the naturalistic fallacy argument, also as an axiology. Furthermore, Gaian religion relies on metaphors of the sacred to express its sense of the preciousness and quality of the whole. The form I have labeled Gaian spirituality is avowedly supernaturalistic, perceiving the superorganism, whether the biosphere or the entire universe, as an expression or part of God, or Brahman, or whatever the divine cosmology might be, the body of God, a divine cosmos, the great mystery, and so on. It is more likely to draw on deviant or non-consensus science for data reinforcing its generally pantheistic or panentheistic and holistic metaphysics, and is more open to interpretations commonly found in subcultures referred to as New Age. The form I'm I have called Gaian naturalism, is agnostic, if not skeptical or disbelieving toward any supernaturalistic metaphysics. It's more likely to restrict its claims to scientific mainstreams as a basis for understanding and promoting holistic metaphysics. Yet its proponents express awe and wonder when facing the complexity and mysteries of life in the universe, relying on religious language and metaphors of the sacred, not always self-consciously, when confessing their own sense of belonging and connection to energy and life systems that they participate in, inhabit, and study. Now, my reflections so far may seem rather abstract, but they're grounded upon long and close observation of the forms and diverse expressions of green religion both in the United States and abroad, especially over the past few decades, but also with an eye to historical antecedents, which is important also to the recognition of novelty and innovation. The second part of this paper reflects the main part of its title, From the Ground Up. And in it I examine some specific examples of the 4 types of dark green religion that I have just briefly characterized. The final part of this paper explores what was signaled in the paper's subtitle, the implications of all this for a prospective green future of religion and ethics. I shall have to race through the second part, giving only a few examples today if I'm to leave any time to look at any depth at some of the things that lead me to speculate about the possibility of a robust green future of religion. Exemplars of such spiritual animism exemplars, I should say, looking at the upper left, of such spiritual animism, and on the upper right, of Gaian spirituality, include 3 thinkers whose spiritual paths intersected with serious encounters with Buddhism: Gary Snyder, Joanna Macy, and John Seed. All 3 identify with deep ecology. Gary Snyder, best known as a beat poet and as one of the architects of bioregionalism, a green social philosophy that seeks to downscale political decision processes so that they can take place within differing ecological regions, places much energy and experimentation in this movement goes into developing regional cultures that can, quote, hear the earth's sacred voices and thereby more easily develop sustainable lifeways. In an interview, Snyder told me that he considers himself a Buddhist animist and conveyed that he thinks the world is full of spiritual intelligences. Most children and many indigenous people who live close to nature have such perceptions, Snyder asserted. But for the masses living in degraded habitats divorced from nature, this perceptivity is lost and must be self-consciously rekindled. The person who came up with the term deep ecology, Arne Nast, a Norwegian philosopher, speaks very similarly about childhood animistic perceptions and their value to the quest for a holistic environmental philosophy. Snyder's solution is to encourage a bioregional re-inhabitation of particular places. By going back to the land, people can recover their ability to hear nature's multivocal sacred voices. With others in his intentional community located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, for a generation and drawing on many traditions, Snyder has been experimenting with nature-related ritual. He told me that he thinks after all this time, we just may be beginning to get it right. Macy and Seed have been on a similar path, but unlike Snyder, have worked tirelessly to spread globally the ritual processes they have developed and believe help to connect people to the earth and its diverse inhabitants. Their best-known ritual process is the Council of All Beings, and it has inspired much further experimentation with nature-focused ritualizing. The sacred intention of that ritualizing has been to reawaken our lost understanding of spiritual realities that they believe animate nature in its many expressions. Part of what is interesting to me in the ritualizing of the council is how the experience varies from one participant to another. Some report being possessed by the spirits of non-human entities as they come to the council, kind of channeling these spirits, speaking for them. Others speak for the DNA or energy pulses permeating the universe, or the felt pain of Gaia herself from mining or from the pollution of her rivers. Still others describe how speaking for a non-human life form is more of an act of moral imagination, a kind of ritualized performance art, in which they surmise and act out what it must feel like to be here on Earth and to be so badly treated by humans. Such participants understand that they are more engaged in an imaginative act than they are in making a mystical, supernatural connection. This last type of understanding I am calling naturalistic animism. So here you see that we have the Council of All Beings upper right, the ritual is in the eye of the beholder, the way it's perceived and experienced by some, and also down here on the lower left. So here I'm referring to forms of animism in which there is either skepticism or disbelief that some parallel spiritual world animates non-human natural entities, but that nevertheless there is a strong felt kinship with non-human life, which provides a basis for a fulfilling life and for ethics. For some such thinkers, moreover, real understanding and communion with non-human life forms is possible. According to Donald Worster, this kind of felt kinship and the biocentric ethics that usually accompanies it can be grounded in evolutionary theory and traced directly to Darwin, who in Notebooks on Transmutation wrote, and as quoted by Professor Worster, if we choose to let conjecture run wild, then animals, our fellow brethren in pain, diseases, death, suffering, and famine, our slaves in the most laborious works, our companions in our amusements, they may partake of our origin in one common ancestor. We may thus be all netted together. Darwin realized that this kind of kinship ethic depended on an act of moral imagination, which he calls conjecture. For Darwin, this ethic involves reflection on our common ancestor and awareness that other animals suffer and face many challenges as we do. From this, a felt communion can arise, a kind of naturalistic animism that is independent of metaphysical speculation or supernaturalistic assumptions. Through interviews with both radical and pragmatic environmentalists, and in widely scattered environmental literatures, I've discovered that such a feeling is common for those who understand the evolutionary narrative and its supposition of a common ancestor. L. Freeman House provides another example of what I'm calling naturalistic animism. A friend of Snyder and a fellow pioneer in the bioregional movement in California, he was part of the hippie-sourced Back to the Land movement there. While living in a remote coastal valley, he became involved with and connected to the salmon, whom he and others labored to protect and bring back to viable populations. In a remarkable 1974 essay entitled Totem Salmon, he described the cultural, spiritual, and material significance of the salmon to the indigenous people of the Pacific Rim. These aboriginal peoples had ceremonies to ensure that the salmon would take no offense when captured, and such a perception was based on, and here I quote, the notion that conscious spirit resides in all plants and animals. Therefore, the salmon is always perceived as a person living a life similar to that of the people who catch it, and the ceremonies have the practical effect of assuring the continuity of both species, salmon and human. I know from an interview with him that he shared the animistic spirituality that he attributed to the indigenous peoples that he had studied. But he also signaled the possibility of a naturalistic animism when he argued that the salmon speak to humans practically about appropriate human lifeways. To paraphrase what he told me, the salmon speak to people, if only by their disappearance. And one of the things that the salmon speak to people is, we need to get serious about this business of co-evolution. This kind of communication strikes me as a kind of naturalistic animism. Many other figures can be considered in a similar light, including the environmental philosopher Paul Taylor, who argued that all beings who are subjects of a life and have interests that must be respected, and Tom Regan, who has articulated an animal rights philosophy grounded in his own affective and personal connection to sentient animals. But I will turn now to Aldo Leopold for my next example, who provides a bridge from animistic naturalism to Gaian spirituality. Leopold's epiphany regarding the intrinsic value of a wolf, a species he had helped to exterminate with both gun and pen, has become a well-known sacred story to many environmentalists. What is striking for our immediate purpose is that he had his epiphany when looking directly into the eyes of a she-wolf that he and his comrades had just shot, just as the green fire died out in her eyes. I could recount many examples where some combination of connection, understanding, and communion occurred between a human being and a non-human being, usually with the human becoming an animal or an animal rights or environmental activist, or, if already such, a more powerful one as a result. For Leopold, however, the Epiphany did not yield only a lesson regarding the value of an individual animal or a species. It reinforced his ethical holism, which was shaped by a complex mix of holistic and even pantheistic metaphysics through the philosophy of the Russian mystical philosopher Peter Opinsky, through scientific understanding, as well as through long observation of nature's cycles. In short, Leopold stood in the organic tradition and in a way that was updated by the ecological science prevalent during his own day, writing, "The land is one organism. The outstanding discovery of the 20th century is the complexity of the land organism." Okay. Now we turn to the category in the lower right, and the type I'm calling Gaian naturalism. And I'm going to kind of walk through these types here: biocentric writers and activists, scientists, restoration ecologists, social scientists, and environmentalists, and just a few quick examples. Joseph Wood Crutch could be considered a green religious archetype. By 1950, he had concluded that humankind's greatest problem was desperate isolation from his only companions on Earth, the other species. And according to Don Worster, who traced much of this change to two things: Crutch's repeated reading of Thoreau, as he put it, once a rather melancholic humanist, Crutch now became a kind of pantheist or ethical mystic, caught up on the joy of belonging to something greater than oneself. And two, an education in ecological principles which confirmed him in an organismism. You know what I'm trying to say, right? Organismic. Thank you. What he said. Organisms. That led directly to a moral awakening, a new sense of biological relatedness and communalism. Does Crutch presage a Gaian naturalism? Worster concluded his discussion with Crutch's own words, that science helped him turn from the pursuit of self toward a sense of the community of living things. And without reverence or love, ecology was empty. Worster then suggested provocatively, from its impact on Crutch and others, it's clear that ecological biology could still lead to natural piety, no matter how many of its leading scientists had purged themselves of such tendencies. That which Worster noticed in Crutch, I find, has become an increasingly prevalent and influential form of dark green religion. For example, in the early 90s, a group of scientists got together in what is now a well-known statement that included these words. By the way, people involved: Stephen Jay Gould, Hans Bethe, Stephen Schneider, Carl Sagan, Peter Raven, a whole bunch of luminaries. As scientists, many of us have had profound personal experiences of awe and reverence before the universe. We understand that what is regarded as sacred is more likely to be treated with care and respect. Our planetary home should be so regarded. Efforts to safeguard and cherish the environment should be infused with a vision of the sacred. They agree. The world pantheist movement seeks to spread such feelings and views such feelings as expressions of a purely naturalistic pantheism. Is nature your spiritual home? Do you feel a sense of peace and belonging and wonder in the midst of nature? Do you find it impossible to believe in supernatural beings and difficult to conceive of anything more worthy of reverence than the beauty of nature or the power of the universe? If so, then you will feel thoroughly at home in the world pantheist movement. It goes on to argue that we need a spirituality of nature because most people have a sense that there's something greater than the self or than even the human race. The movement's natural reverence for nature can satisfy this need without sacrificing logic or respect for evidence and science. The world pantheist movement does not require faith in miracles, invisible entities, and so forth. And this kind of credo goes on the website for a longer period of time. And interestingly, it ends up urging visitors to social and environmental action, including by endorsing the Earth Charter and by fighting global warming and encouraging people to get involved in the struggle to overcome global inequality. And interestingly, it lists a whole group of both honorary members and those that it considers its soulmates, including Albert Einstein, Mikhail Gorbachev, Stephen Hawking, Margaret Atwood, Thoreau, and Sitting Bull. Next category, restoration ecologists. I'm not saying that nothing here is problematic. We can get into that later. The next category is restoration ecologists. And here I just want to mention two. That we could talk about Wes Jackson. He's better known. There's a group called the Wild Ones that is involved in prairie restoration back where I used to teach in Wisconsin and elsewhere. And one of the founders of this place said, well, we're like environmentalists in a lot of ways. We're trying to save sacred places, but we do it more quietly. And Wild Ones encourages us to establish a personal relationship with the natural world, a relationship that literally invites native plants and wildlife back into our immediate lives. I find myself wondering, and listening to that rhetoric, whether these people could have come up with that kind of language without an evangelical Christian background. But be that as it may, you get a little bit of that sense of personal connection to place. And then, interestingly, not only Wes Jackson, but folks like William Jordan, who wrote The Sunflower Forest, who've been practitioners of restoration ecology, are increasingly seeing it as a ritual practice, self-consciously so, one that should be cultivated in that manner. And it's a way to help people connect even more closely to the land. What about social scientists? I'm going to mention just one here. There's a brilliant political theorist at Johns Hopkins named Dan Dudney, and he coined the term terrapolitan earth religion for the idea of what I've been calling a civic earth religion. And he asserts that a global earth spirituality is needed if people are going to come to a place where they put loyalty to the earth above provincial political loyalties and particular religious beliefs. With such theory, such a spirituality could coexist with diverse, plural, traditional religious beliefs while fusing these into a reverence for the biosphere that would galvanize humanity and work toward a sustainable world. Let me give you one example of this kind of sentiment. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Last group here, environmentalists. This is one example, a poster from a Sierra Club poster. And I think somebody here said earlier that maybe environmentalists need to begin to take this religion variable more seriously. And here's an example where Sierra Club people are increasingly comfortable expressing their own form of what we might call a kind of naturalistic earth spirituality. Here it says, this is not about getting back to nature. It's about understanding we've never left. And look at the kind of implicit kinship ethic here with the human legs resembling the bark of the trees surrounding them. And then just from some of the prose there, this connection is as personal as it is fundamental. You either feel it or you don't. Sierra Club members feel it. When you accept your connection to nature, you suddenly can't look at the work without seeing something personal in it. You work for the planet because you belong to it. I could give you another example of this kind of animistic spirituality with Jane Goodall, but I need to press on here. And I just want to focus for a minute on the root of the word religion. It's most commonly linked to the Latin root meaning to tie or to bind fast. And this kind of language, common within the environmental milieu, seems to signal a religious consciousness. In general, religion is usually associated with feelings of dependence, connection, belonging, and transformative power. Such perceptions can be understood as religious and their social carriers as religious movements. That last thing timed out, by the way, whoever our tech people are. But it says battery low, panel shutting down. I hope we don't shut down completely. Yeah, but I can do that this way, I think. That's good. So to just summarize my presentation here so far, Earth-centered spiritualities are breaking out of their more countercultural breeding grounds. And they share these sorts of characteristics. A perception that nature is sacred, usually accompanied with animistic or pantheistic perceptions or experiences, usually complemented with an evolutionary worldview, a sense of dependence, connection, and belonging to this sacred world, a feeling that these sorts of connections and experiences are transformative and healing, and that kinship feelings toward non-human nature and ethical obligations to prevent the world's desecration go along hand. And part of my thesis here is that this kind of religion is going global. Trying to make this go back. Oh, the joys of technology. Yeah. So just to the third part of the paper here, and the part that I've had to, I don't know what happened on my screen here. I've got like two pages that's just for summary, and it's now AWOL. Okay. So here's the questions I want to end with. The evidence for this kind of globalization of green religion is widespread. And I think there's evidence that if we had more time, we could lay out a whole bunch of different examples of how this is having a political impact, including with ritualizing at the United Nations venues. But such religion has yet to prove it can make a decisive political impact, but it is reaching beyond the environmental intelligentsia and into grassroots movements such as the United Nations. If we wanted to look at evidence in this regard, in addition to the United Nations, we could look at the kinds of ideas and ritualizing of at all places at Disneyland. We could look at, as diverse an example as the Earth Charter Initiative, and the ways in which the effort to promote it assumes ritual forms. We could look at Mother Earth spirituality at Earth Day celebrations. At Earth Day celebrations, I could show you video from the Olympics where that was celebrated, and, as I mentioned, at United Nations venues. Even scholarly interests in ethnobiology, traditional ecological knowledge, and so forth, among anthropologists, ecologists, and environmentalists can be seen as this, as examples of this. And then finally, the demarcation of biosphere reserves and World Heritage sites can be viewed as newly identified sacred places that spiritually value both cultural and biological diversity. So if we understand a lot of times we think about sacred spaces, and in religious studies there's a big debate about whether sacred spaces are something that people apprehend, like Eliade, or more along the lines of Jonathan Z. Smith, are sacred places that are constructed and they have to do with power relationships and the values that lead to their construction. Well, even if we go with the Jonathan Z. Smith approach, we can get a sense that, clearly, places that people consider sacred over time, at some place, they were invented or constructed in that way. And through political processes and by both nation states and in United Nations venues, arguably there is the invention and construction of new sacred spaces, the kind of places that we find in Costa Rica and elsewhere that we talked about earlier, can be viewed in this way. And perhaps an expression of this kind of nascent, emerging, global civic earth religion. So, whether there will be a green future for religion and ethics will depend in part on how successful its diverse proponents will be at making peace among advocates of supernaturalistic religions, theistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, and animist, and those expressing non-supernaturalistic spiritualities of connection that eschew what they consider to be speculative metaphysics. Equally important, how will shifting ecological paradigms be integrated into green religion and ethics? This is also a question that Worcester posed at the end of Nature's Economy that in some very provocative ways that if we have more time we can talk about. How do the spiritual paradigms change when we move from a Clementian kind of model of harmony and balance, and we keep hearing those tropes all the time, when the latest paradigms are sometimes called dynamic ecology, and the focus of contemporary ecology is much different. This is something that also needs to be integrated as people think about where religion and ecology goes today. Finally, I wonder out loud with you whether such a civic earth religion could emerge, and if so, whether it might erode the power of nationalism and facilitate international environmental cooperation, whether the Earth Charter and its potential ratification would be an example of that. Dan Dundy wonders out loud, hypothetically, what if all the nation states around the world flew the NASA image of Earth above the flags of the nation states? What kind of consciousness change might that have? And would it, and if so, how would it affect religion? Would it help to lead religions of all sorts to be more adaptive ecologically than maladaptive? So these are all open questions to me, and maybe we can take them up a little bit later. So thank you very much.